Hello and welcome to today's 18 Group webinar on the future of KYC and AML, how to tackle the challenges and gain the opportunities of perpetual KYC or pKYC as we'll probably call it today. My name is Sarah Underwood, I'm an editor at 18 Group and I'll be moderating today's webinar. Our expert speakers today are Cecile Monico, Client Lifecycle Management Solutions Lead at Luxoft, Chor Teh, Head of Client Lifecycle Management at Investec Bank, Gareth Walker, Head of Digital and Client Onboarding at Refinitiv, and Sam Sheen, Founder and Director of Ante Advisory. I'll be asking them to introduce themselves in just a moment, but first a little bit of information for you to make most use of the webinar. To the right of the video, you'll see a box for questions and polls. We'll be running 3 polls during the webinar. I'll let you know when they're coming up, so do please vote and we can see some of your thinking from that. Also, please feel free to ask questions to our speakers at any time. We'll take the questions throughout the webinar rather than saving them to the end so that we can answer as many as possible. So if you use those facilities, we'll be sure to answer as much as we can. So enough of me and over to our speakers. Cecile, would you like to introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about your interest here in KYC and AML?
Yes, thank you, Sarah. So Cecile Monico, I'm looking after client lifecycle management solutions at Luxoft, as you said. I've actually spent 20 years of my life in banking as a CFO, CEO of various areas of the operations, and only the last 5 years I decided to move to the other side of the fence and actually help my former colleagues in operations, risk and compliance to work better or improve the way they work and actually support front office or other revenue generation functions as well as finance, risk and compliance. So my interest here is to see how with perpetual KYC we can actually improve the risk monitoring at bank levels and make sure that actually all the financials are engaged the right way. It's a challenge, it's a game changer, but worth it.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. Over to you, Chor.
Hi everyone, I'm Chor Teh. I'm currently head of client lifecycle management here in Investec Bank PLC. So my interest is the same as all the other panelists here. So I've got a strong passion trying to make CLM not just a control function, and how do we add value in the business context. So that's where I think pKYC will become a topic that is very close to my heart.
Okay, thank you very much. And over to you, Gareth. You've got your mute on.
Thank you, Sarah.
No problem.
Gareth Walker, can't use the mute button apparently. I look after the client onboarding and digital onboarding businesses here at Refinitiv. My background, a little like Cecile's, is initially on the practitioner side. I worked in areas on the banking side, both on the broker dealer and on the buy side, where I was involved in or participating in onboarding processes. I suppose a little earlier than Cecile, I made the jump over to the vendor side to help work on solutions that hopefully assisted those processes. For me, pKYC, I think, as was said before, is definitely a potential game changer. I think the tools that we're building now are potentially helpful in that regard. I think actually it's to me, pKYC will almost be a byproduct of the move towards better technology and better data services. And you know, as I say, the organization I work for is a provider of both of those.
Okay, and over to you, Sam.
Hi there, my name is Sam Sheen. I have worked in a variety of roles, both in the private sector as well as working as a regulator, heading up AML and enforcement. I work with both fintechs and with regtechs on operationalizing AML compliance requirements. And I am an approved subject matter expert with the Council of Europe on various financial crime topics. And my area of specialization and interest in this topic in particular is around taking complicated AML regulation and turning it into something practical. And I see pKYC as, in fact, probably one of the most seminal, but not really regarded as highly relevant areas in relation to risk management. And it's something that's really been neglected for a lot of years and siloed. And so I'm interested in seeing how it's coming to the forefront of probably the most effective way you can risk mitigate against financial crime.
Excellent. We've got a lot to talk about. Clearly, that's great. So thank you all. Let's get started with an audience poll. The question is, to what extent is your organization interested in and or acting on the implementation of perpetual KYC? While you answer the question, let me come to Chor to set the scene and talk a little bit about how the concept of perpetual KYC, perpetual KYC is evolving, and which types of financial institutions are showing sort of initial interest and or progress.
Sure, I'll start off. Thanks, Sarah. I'll start off with some statistics recently published by PwC and LexisNexis. So about a new approach of reviews, and in other words, pKYC. So the report stated that it's the number, again, is a shocking number, $5.8 billion across Asia Pacific, Australia, and New Zealand, that the financial institution are still struggling to perform reviews due to complicated process, time-consuming, high volume, some sort of manual process that involved, and then there was a lack of coordination between people and technology. We're hearing similar themes across UK, Europe, and North America. So what is perpetual KYC? In my own understanding, is a concept that summarized by an approach of leveraging the RegTech of today that enables the end-to-end automation. There will be a degree of human involvement, but the idea of it is to utilize majority of technology to do most of the work. So there is a prerequisite to this, is to collect and store this information digitally, and to be able to continuously leverage on technology, identify changes regardless of materiality. So that's my understanding of interpretation. Of course, the good news is there are proven examples that some of these are working, and some of those are as high as 60% effort saved on a total effort basis. So the point here is made by Gareth earlier on. pKYC, IC, and some of my peers that I spoke to, we see that that's the future. It's definitely a more efficient way of looking at processes going forward.
Okay, thank you, Gareth. What would you add there? How do you see things out there when you're with clients and so on?
I think very similar to Chor. I think in terms of the types of institutions, I think it's interesting. Different firms, different sizes and types of organization are looking at what I think you can define in the way Chor did as pKYC, but they're coming at it from slightly different angles. I think the larger, more established firms who already have big books of clients and big remediation exercises and big refresh cycles to deal with. I think they're probably more advanced in the discussions, probably because they are acutely feeling that pain every time they come around to those annual reviews, and that's clearly a big drag on resources. And to Chor's point, although I think the technology is becoming more and more available, it's not always being properly used, or it's not being used consistently. It's better in some regions and areas than others. And I think they're probably the more advanced in the conversation in some respects, because of looking to achieve those cost savings, those efficiencies, and ultimately to be smarter about the way they're handling their compliance risk. I think what's interesting for me is the smaller firms, though, who are perhaps new entrants into the market, the startups, the fintechs, crypto firms I speak to in particular. They don't have the same incumbent problem, if you like, that the big established financial organizations do. But then they're also wary of the challenges that have been faced by those organizations, and are trying from the outset to build tech stacks and operating models that basically prevent them falling into that trap a number of years down the line. I think they're also, the growth rates of some of these firms are exponential. I mean, over the course of 6 months or so, they can, quadruple or more the times their client base over and over and over again. I think they're acutely aware, if they don't solve for the problem now, if they don't get the processes right up front, if they don't have the right customer engagement mechanisms, the right data sources, they're just kicking the can down the road, and they're going to have a problem there. It's interesting between the two firms, because I think the larger firms tend to have the budgets and the appetite to do something about it, but they've got more architecture and infrastructure to move. The smaller firms don't have the sort of the existing problem, but they probably don't have the budget either to spend on it. So there's a bit of a mismatch there between how firms want to handle it. But certainly, I think the commonality is people see this as the way forward, and whether it's to reduce the existing cost or prevent the incurring of it in the first place. I think people recognize that the event-based trigger reviews rather than just scheduled periodic are the far better way to go.
Okay, Sam, what would you say here?
Well, I think it's been really interesting because it's sort of requiring a significant culture change around how we set up our compliance functions. So traditionally, we've tried to get cost savings by having KYC in one place, transaction monitoring in another. Perhaps we outsource our triage for any alerts we receive. And what we're seeing with regulator decisions is they're making it really clear that siloed approach isn't working because the trends, the emerging risks, things that should tell us that what we think walks like a duck and quacks like a duck is not a duck, are not being transferred efficiently. So long periods of time can go where there's significant changes about a customer's risk profile in their transaction activity, but it's not sent back in terms of looking at their KYC and perhaps changing their risk rating. And to achieve that, technology is certainly one component, but it's also rethinking the way we set up these teams, how they work together, how they exchange information, and how we prioritize those activities. And that's a really, really big challenge for a lot of institutions. Some of the larger ones under regulatory orders or adverse decisions have made tremendous investments. ABN AMRO is one really good example of some phenomenal change that's happening there. But for smaller businesses as well, it's really changing that mindset of there's only one thing that you can be good at, and actually starting to think, how do you get people to think KYC isn't just a Polaroid shot of the customer, it's something you need to know throughout the whole time you have them.
Okay, that's great. Can we see the poll results, please? And Gareth, would you like to make a comment on this? Is this what you might expect?
Pretty much, I'd say that it is. I think that most firms, as you can see there, are looking at implementing something or how they could implement it, and most of those that aren't are either interested in doing so or making plans to do so. But I think it's interesting that there's only 9% are actually in the process of doing so, and I think that's probably because of some of the challenges I've already mentioned. The fact that this isn't something one area or one part of the organization can do on their own. This has to be front to back, multiple stakeholders, technology investment, people investment, training, the mindset shift that Sam mentioned. I think it requires a lot of investment from a lot of people to make this work. And so it doesn't necessarily surprise me that firms are more in the planning and the thinking stage than they are the implementation stage.
Okay, that's great. Thank you very much indeed. And staying with you, Gareth, you've sort of nearly answered the next question, is what do firms really need to be thinking about when they're approaching pKYC? And obviously we talked a bit about the culture and so on. And what limitations will they hit as they go along?
I think the main thing is you've got to view this as an end-to-end thing. And to pick up on Sam's point, for this to be effective, it's not something you do at snapshots. It's not something that traditionally gets done at an onboarding stage and then forgotten about until 2-3 years down the road. It has to be ongoing, and therefore you need an end-to-end solution to be able to cater for it. And I think it's probably fair to say there isn't one single vendor that covers that entire end-to-end stack in terms of the technology and the compliance, so the data aspects. And that's before you've thought about the mindset shifts and the compliance advisory and all those other pieces as well. Navigating the market of all of the vendors out there is not a straightforward thing to do. If you're, again, a very well-established firm with large procurement departments, potentially you have a resource that can focus on that. But the sort of small mid-sized firms, it can be pretty impenetrable, and there's ostensibly a lot of vendors out there who do the same kind of things, and figuring out who you'd use in different geographies or who's better than another is no small effort in itself before you even put the solution in place. I think the other thing I'd say is that the technology and the data points, getting the data externally and not bothering the client, and using APIs to gather that data electronically on an ongoing basis and for monitoring purposes, they're all very valid component parts of this. But I think we forget the customer at the end of it at our peril. And again, to Sam's point, this is about knowing that customer. And I think often the solutions that are easier for a bank to consume are the ones that are, let's buy some data, or let's take a screening feed on a more regular basis to check for event changes. But actually, that's all fine. But identifying a change, identifying a problem is one thing. If you don't have the mechanism by which to then resolve it, so to gather the new information, all you've done is create yourself arguably a bigger problem. And so having a means by which to be able to contact the client efficiently and gather information you need from them, which you won't always need for every event, but you will for some, I think is really important. And often that can be a bit of an afterthought. And the old adage, rubbish in, rubbish out, I don't think could be true here. It's often also that outreach process is the most time consuming and expensive, therefore, part of this process. And it's probably the most difficult to solve for too. But I think, there are the changes that have been made in the last, say, 3, 4, 5 years around digital identity and the ability to gather that information digitally from a client using applications, mobile phones or tablets or desktop computers they are already engaged with. That can be a big win here, and it's something that needs to be considered as part of the process overall.
Okay, Cecile, let me bring you in here. How can firms approach this, and what should they be taking into account? Obviously, Gareth's gone over some of it. How do you see this?
Yes, I mean, I may repeat a different way what my colleagues have been saying already, but maybe to start from the beginning. So pKYC is a proactive approach, right, where you create a digital profile and you want to be able to refresh that digital profile dynamically in response to very specific triggers. So if you think about it, there are many aspects to consider when you go into a transition from the traditional KYC to the perpetual one. Obviously, you have to have a digital operating model, which is not very often the case in the first place. You have to think of your end-to-end connectivity. So it's not only which systems are the best one to constitute your setup. It's also how fungible are them? How can you connect them together? Because the flow of data has to be fluid, so that has to be totally interconnected end to end. You have to think of your change management program, because we still going to have people going through this process. So you can't let them aside and only think of the systems. And you have to think of your operational capacity model, because the way it's going to work is going to be less predictable, right? So as such, if you consider all those aspects, I can see 4 main limitations. One is the acceptance by all functions of the bank, the maturity of each of those functions. Sometimes for risk compliance type of functions, and probably many others, even in operation, removing the human intervention in something that is a challenge, right? So it has to be properly tested, agreed, validated, and so on, probably as well for the regulator, actually. You have to, all of that will create stronger dependencies on your data management. So that's the quality of data always, anywhere, everywhere is a big question mark. But in that specific case, we are really dependent on the data that are being sourced and how they are being utilized. That's very important. I mentioned earlier the integration and the fungibility of the systems, critical. And that's something really we have to consider. And also the capacity model, because today it's very easy to say, so, traditional way, every year, 3 years, 5 years, you have your KYC refresh, you know what to expect, you have some backlogs and so on, but setting that apart, you know what is the flow and what is the cycle. In this specific case of perpetual KYC, because the refresh is dynamic, it can happen anytime. But it will also happen only for on a certain base, on a certain criteria, and for some certain type of people, all to be defined by the bank. But it means that the capacity of the team dealing with that would have to be reconsidered. How you build the model of your capacity for this team. So that's something that probably is important, and we always forget, right? We think about changes, systems, but the people there, and your capacity, it's critical to make sure you have the right guys and the right resources, right knowledge, and right number to again support revenue generation functions.
Okay, that's great. Chor, I'm going to come back to you for this. I'm sure there is no finite answer, but give us an indication of what are the practical costs and savings of implementing pKYC. Is there a balance there?
I will focus a little bit more on the optimism side, such as the ROI. So there's 2 points I will just focus on. First one is, I think what we get from a control function perspective is that pKYC enable real-time risk mitigation function. I'll take the Russian-Ukrainian situation that we experienced. So if you have the connectivity through the RegTech onto the data provider that you have today, you would have known that much more upfront. You can do something about it, or at least you can plan about what are you going to do with your remediation, because the data is within your hands of reach. So that's what I see is the first change. The second thing is if they are a company that are connected to jurisdiction that are data rich, when there's a change of ownership or UBO, those data can be pushed to the front of the interface of that user, and they can react to it. Yeah, there's also a benefit that I will talk on a little bit more related to how this can add business value. The second point I'll talk about on the ROI is definitely the cost. So I think the various paper sayings keep mentioning about either the KYC or financial crime function. The cost of it is about what, 3%, sometimes more of the operating cost for a company, for an organization. So it's quite a significant cost. So if I do a few numbers here, we do a simple calculation to do a corporate reviews on a generic corporate client and a corporate on a normal bank. So 3 days to collect data from the client, half a day to source information, and half a day to do sort of through tech, 1 day to do a QC and approval. So you normally need about 4 to 5 days to do a client. And if you have a 5 analyst team, in a month, you could do about 20 reviews, or sometimes more, depending on how fast it is. Now, with pKYC, what it would enable you is that screening, that collecting of data could reduce down to as close as 10 minutes or even less. Then what you ask the client from is those what you couldn't get. So that might reduce the time from 3 days to a day and a half. So assuming that the QC and approval process still takes about a day, you actually half the time from 5 days to 2.5 days. Again, with the same analyst, this will touch on the point by Cecile, mentioned by Cecile, the capacity issue. Same analyst, five people, using less about the time. In a month, you can actually do more than 40 cases than the 20 cases just by correctly applying the RegTech. So I hope that gives an indication of what.
Okay, you frozen a bit there, but I think an indication of what could be done. So Gareth, would you agree with that as a sort of investment versus outcome?
For sure. I think, as Chor was saying, that the cost savings can be significant. I mean, depending on which report you read, and as you sort of identified at the start, Sarah, it will vary from organization to organization. But I think cost savings as high as sort of 80%, I think, on the existing footprint of KYC are possible. Certainly, I would say that's the very upper end, and I think it will take time to get all the way there. But I think it's a sliding scale, and I think that over time it's possible to make significant savings against those budgets. I think the other thing is, though, to echo Joel's point about optimism, there's another way of looking at this as well, and I think this we shouldn't. If KYC has been perceived in the past as being a burden and overhead, something you do as infrequently as possible because no one wants to do it, whether it's the firm or the client, no one really wants to partake of the process. But if we're moving to a model where basically we know that we're only reaching out to a client because there's a good reason to, because there's been an event that's led us to, there's also an opportunity there. And that opportunity could be because that event that's caused us to reach out likely means that there might be opportunity there to upsell the client or to understand more about them. Obviously, there could be a risk mitigation factor in there as well, and then therefore it might be more about scaling back business. But I think that if we've got the right channels in place to do that client outreach, if clients know they're not having their time wasted and they're only being reached out to at the point where it's relevant and necessary, then actually there's an opportunity. If you've got the right kind of friction, if you like, with the client, we all talk about these frictionless client experiences, but sometimes a bit of contact, a reason to pick up the phone, as long as that's being done in a way where there's a positive customer experience for the client, it can provide opportunity as well. And I think that we shouldn't shy away from it. We should stop thinking about the KYC process purely being a regulatory burdens discharge and start thinking about it in the truest sense of the words. We should know our clients. That means we know who they are. We know what they need. If that changed from the product we sold them a year or 6 months ago to now, based on the current environment, Chor mentioned what's happening in the Ukraine and Russia. creates opportunity within the market, and certainly it creates need for things from clients. And we shouldn't just look at this as being something that's a drain on resource, when potentially it could offer us the opportunity for a positive conversation with the client, as well as a means of collecting more up-to-date information or asking questions that might go into our risk modeling for them.
Okay. Cecile, did you want to add something there?
Yes, but in a nutshell, what we're doing by moving from a traditional KYC to pKYC is we make it less admin oriented and more in consistency with the idea of generating, cross-selling, upselling, knowing your client, not only from the admin side of things, which, yes, nobody is very happy to do, even though we have to do it from a regulation standpoint, but also taking the advantage of having contact with the client and effectively check other stuff. So it's really has to be thought through this way. And if you look at it this way and you add the number that Chor was mentioning, or Gareth, it is worth it. It's worth the investment, because there is an investment initially, right? There is no miracle in there. So it's kind of a long, challenging process. But in the end, it helped with the admin side, it helped with the regulation side, and it helps with the bank numbers as well.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. Let's take another audience poll here. The question: what are the drivers of pKYC implementation if your organization is considering or implementing a solution? On this occasion, you can tick as many of the boxes as you like, or as are appropriate perhaps. And while you do that, let me come back to Cecile and find out a little bit about what she thinks regulators want to see from firms' KYC solutions, and to what extent pKYC could achieve this and help firms avoid fines for regulatory non-compliance.
Yeah, so in principle, it's quite simple. The expectations of the regulator are ultimately for the bank to be continuously on top of their risk monitoring, right? If you think of, again, the traditional way, when the KYC is done every 1, 3, or 5 years, depending on the perceived level of the risk of the client, and this leaves quite a lengthy gaps in firms' view of the risk. And that could put firms in significant risk of money laundering or regulatory actions. So what the regulator is looking for is for the bank to have a more proactive, a more robust approach, where they would maintain and monitor the risk of their clients by having accurate and up-to-date client information. So that's the basis of what the regulator is asking all his clients or banks to do. Having said that, again, removing all the routine of a regular KYC and having it on a more dynamic way helps as well to reduce the process and to maintain the due diligence to what is necessary. So in a way of managing by exception versus managing by routine, which is something that can be efficient on the bank side as well. So what the regulator wants is not very new. It's just that we have now, or we perceive the tools and how to set that up. So yeah, let's go for it and let's do it. Yeah.
Okay, Sam, what do you see there from the regulatory perspective?
I just think nobody's known how to do it properly. And I think sometimes that's extended to the regulators themselves, right? I mean, look, we all know you can make whatever schedule you want to make. You may be required in your country to review your high-risk customers once a year. You may promise you are not going to wait till December to review them all, and dollars to donuts, another project will get in the way, and lo and behold, you've fallen behind on your reviews, and you're no longer able to focus on why it is you're doing the review. You're now working against the numbers. The other problem I've seen is that people don't know what they're supposed to be reviewing. So you have people who know they've got a trigger or they have a scheduled review, and they just review everything that's on that particular record. They're not thinking why they're looking at it, what's relevant to be looking at, what's the thing they should be looking at that would make the biggest difference to the risk score. So I think in some respects, the push has been so heavy on how often you should review, the circumstances you should conduct a review, that we've not been very good around what is it you're supposed to be looking at? And when you found it, what are you supposed to do then? So I think there is a real need to have that discussion before you even start to decide on any technology, because if you don't know what it is you want to look at, then you can't properly set up the technology.
Okay, fair enough indeed. And let's see those poll results, if we may. And Sam, would you like to comment on these? Oh, Regulatory compliance there up the top. What would you say, Sam?
I would say it's a shame that that's the driver, because really, if we really thought about what's the cost of non-compliance, the opportunity cost that comes with having to spend loads of money on catch-up and remediation, distracting from other priorities and emerging risks, we would really see that not doing perpetual KYC properly is a real commercial loss. So I get why this is the driver, because this is the song we've all been dancing to. It's just a real shame.
Okay, let's see if we repeat this next year, if we see a difference, which will be more encouraging perhaps. So thanks for that. And Gareth, coming back to you, what are the essential elements of pKYC and how can you ensure they're integrated correctly and they can at the end provide us a watertight and seamless solution?
I think we've touched on some of them already. I think that the data is kind of key, and I think to Sam's point, the right data to review the right things and get the right triggers, because if you just check everything all of the time, every day, you create a bigger problem, because you have the same problem you have on a scheduled basis, but to Cecile's point, you don't have the resources to deal with it, and now you're reviewing your entire client base on that basis, on a daily basis or on a weekly basis or whatever, and that then you're going to have a wood for trees problem, which is obviously not helpful. But I think it's the quality of the data and the metadata as well is really important. So to take screening as an example, that's the obvious one. I think people tend to do ongoing screening, particularly on their higher risk entities on a more regular basis. And there's an element of pKYC event-based review going on an ongoing basis there anyway. But one of the things we're doing in our WorldCheck product, for example, is looking at how we can enhance the metadata around the hits to not just say there's a hit, go look at it and figure out if it's a problem or not, but actually help our clients classify a little bit better into this is a hit that probably is going to warrant your attention because it's someone becoming a PEP, or it's someone adverse media because they're linked with terrorist financing or money laundering, which is clearly something you want to be aware of, versus something that's much more nondescript and much more kind of binary. Now, clearly we can't make the decisions for our clients, but there's still a balance that we can give more information that will enable either the users or the ML or the AI technologies that can review these hits and ultimately get to a place where more of them are being discounted automatically. That's sort of where I think the direction of travel needs to be. I think there's something that Sam mentioned earlier on, though, that I think is really interesting about that shift from a compliance standpoint as well, the mindset. And I think that is hugely important, because what we're basically, I think for this to work, there has to be an acceptance that in some cases we are going to rely on technology broadly to do the job that otherwise has been done by a human being. And I think there is this, sometimes, depending on the side of the fence you're on, I think sometimes there's a tendency to presume the human being always gets it right and always exhibits perfect judgment. And despite the fact they're doing what is essentially often a monotonous task and they're doing it over and over again, they'll always be right. And we sort of forget that that isn't the case. I think machines will always do what you tell them to do, but it's, to Sam's point earlier, it's making sure we're asking them to do the right things in the first place. But there has to be an acceptance for the cost savings to be realized and for, frankly, the whole thing to be practicable, that we are going to do things, we're going to use the technology available to us, and some things are going to be processed automatically using, the machine learning or the AI and the metadata, and we're going to make decisions without looking at them. And I think that can be a big shift in mindset for some people who just aren't comfortable with the idea of machines doing that, algorithms making the decisions.
Okay, Chor, what would you say in terms of the parts and how they can be integrated to make a very good service?
I would agree with Gareth. In fact, I would just focus on, I'll take out the people part, take out the policy part. I'll focus on just one part mentioned by Gareth, which is the mindset change. In how I see it is fairly key. So mindset in how we see data, that within that subset, I think there's 5 things. Digital KYC profile mentioned by both Cecile and some of the analysts here. You're going to be able to store these data points digitally, including time print, date prints, very minute data. Then you do look at the what I call it, the data aggregation. How are you going to link the source of data of multiple sources to a source, like a UBO? So a Chor Teh versus Chor Teh, Chor A Teh or Chor C Teh, they actually mean the same person to an extent. Yeah. The third part is the data management. How do you manage the data between the risk related data versus the non-risk related data, and depending on what the category of risk they are. The fourth point, which I think is a key point that people actually thought that it is purely for reporting purpose, is the MI. I think it's the most important part of the journey, is because MI plays a key role in backing up the storytelling. That storytelling could be to the stakeholders, to the business where they pay, and how they see the ROI and their investment, and the client side of the story, and how you can actually use the intelligence that we have around professional.
Okay. We've lost you, Chor, so let's carry on, but that was very helpful. Sam, what would you add there? We've said a lot already, but what would you add?
I think really just think about a pragmatic approach. I'll tell a very quick story. So I moved house, and of course, like all good people, right, I forgot to notify various pension companies, et cetera, that I'd moved. And so I had one company who notified me that their pKYC detected I had moved. Was this my new address? And they provided it and said, could you please confirm? Another one of the financial institutions I deal with didn't realize for some time I'd moved. I finally told them, and then I was sent a 4-page document I had to fill out in pen with proof and a certified copy of the fact that I had moved to my new address, which was really fun during the pandemic, because apparently I also had to find someone to certify it at the same time. And in the meantime, all I kept thinking was it would just be easier to change my account to somebody else. So I think in some ways, we really need to think about right down to the really practical level, which is it's a regulatory compliance requirement, but there can be ways to make this painless for the customer and still achieve compliance. So when we're thinking about how we want to design this, we need to also think about inevitably there's going to be some interaction with some customers. So how do we do this in a way that matters, not in a lazy way by sending them 4 sheets because we couldn't be bothered and some poor person's gonna have to type it all back into a system. So fat finger syndrome, typing in things wrong. But what can we think about along the way to go? What makes it easy for us, makes it easy for them, and at the end of the day gets us what we need? And I think we forget that sometimes. We sort of jump right in the middle of trying to do it without really thinking, well, how will we get it? What will we do with it? Exactly, as Chor's described, but then really granularly thinking, what are all the ways this could possibly get messed up? Or are we prepared to wait? And what if a customer never answers? If we send them forms, if that's our response to a change? So I think having great brainstorming sessions with your frontline people, as well as your compliance people, to talk about, what do you see as the challenges? What do you see things that might work or not work? Really reveals things that maybe you may not see if you work full-time in the second line.
Okay, that's great. We have time, I think, to squeeze in a final poll question here. Is what are the challenges, in your terms, our audience, of implementing and sustaining pKYC? So again, you can tick as many boxes as appropriate. And while you do that, let me ask Cecile to talk about how she sees the challenges of implementation and ongoing pKYC services.
Challenging, I see it very challenging, because as we said, we know the theory, we don't really know exactly how it works, and we were discussing as well, putting together a use case and so on, and it's not that obvious because not many banks have started, and even less have implemented something that is close to pKYC. So, and as usual, that little devil is in the detail. So we know that the challenges will be covering 3 pillars: the system, the people, the processes, as usual. We know that the challenges would be about the fungibility of the system. It would be about the quality of the data and how you aggregate them, how you deduplicate them, how you use them at the right time, in the right place in the process, and so on. I think for me, one main challenge as well is when you look at it and you take some step back is what is the business case we are trying to achieve here? What is the problem statement? And what is the problem statement, and how do you build the business case actually? So problem statement obviously primarily is about compliance and risk and so on. Fine, I think that's all clear. But also it's leveraging this opportunity, as we said before, to actually take a benefit from it from a front office line and sales perspective, by knowing better our client, what they want, what they don't want, why do they want to go and trade on that product or not that one, what type of client segment do they have themselves, and how can we help with that. So to me, the main thing to start would be to have a strong business statement and a strong business case for each of the bank. And it will be different from, I mean, maybe some similarities, but it will be different from one bank to the other, depending on the type of bank, you know, wealth assets, consumer asset management, investment banking, retail, the size of the financial institution we're talking about. So having that business case really understood internally will definitely help drive the execution, because people will understand why they have to do that and why they have to look after, you know, those systems, those data, that capacity model and the process and so on. It makes it, you know, having a purpose. But I think the primary challenge for me is that one. So maybe it seems a bit more, you know, high level, but I think we have to address that if we want to make it a success ultimately.
Okay, Gareth, quickly, what do you see here as the challenges when you're implementing?
I think Cecile's absolutely right about the business case and knowing why it is that we're trying, what we're trying to achieve here. And I don't think it should be branded just as being, oh, we're moving to pKYC. I think it has to be a bit more, we have to have that big lofty goal, but I think there also has to be acknowledgements that there needs to be steps along the way, and that primarily, actually, this should be as much about getting the right process and getting the right, you know, from front to back, from the policy through to the operational processes, then through the technology assets that you're going to use to work against that policy and to dispose of the procedure. Automating a bad procedure, it's still a bad procedure. You're still not, to the point Sam made earlier on, if you're not checking the right things, it's a waste of everybody's time. So I think it's making sure that we understand, and firms understand what is they're trying to achieve, making sure their policies and their on the compliance side and also on the operational side are lined up doing the right things, and then finding ways on probably a more piecemeal basis, saying, okay, how do we automate that part of the process? What's the best data set to gather there? And then I think you'll see those incremental gains, and maybe you'll get up to the size that, you know, the 80% savings that have been talked about before. But I think there are some wins to get along the way. But I think for me, the priority has to be making sure you're actually you're looking to automate and make event-based the right procedure and the right policies in the first place. Because if you try and do this in isolation with an operations division using the existing policies compliance made that were, you know, embedded in a completely sort of risk methodology, we're going to end up in you know, a bigger hole very, very soon. And then I think pKYC will get a bad rep, a bad brand against it. People think it failed and move away from it. And actually, it's not about that. As I say, it's automating a bad process is still a bad process.
Sure. Okay. Let me ask, could we see the poll results, please? And Cecile, would you like to comment on these?
Sorry, moving my videos as well. All right. So challenges start with sourcing required high quality data, shortage of budgets, achieving required level of automation. Actually, it's in order. Lack of management buy-in. So yeah, I think obviously data can come first, because it's a challenge everywhere, anyway, whatever we do. In those days, people can see that, you know, you really have to have a business case to make sure you have the right budget and the right resources for the right purpose. So I understand that having the issue of seeing your resources and budget being cut can be a problem. And achieving the required level of automation comes together with those systems automation and so on. If you don't have your management buy-in, then you have a problem, right? And you probably should start with that. But if people don't see it as too much of a challenge, it's probably a good sign that actually we could, you know, hope that the move to pKYC will happen sooner rather than later.
Okay. Yeah. So saying data quality, it shows up everywhere, doesn't it? Thanks for that. Thank you for voting, and thank you for the poll. Okay, a quick one here, Gareth. Are there particular RegTech tools that you can use? We've talked about data quality, automation, things like that. Are there any quick wins with RegTech?
I think there are some. I think it's interesting. I find it interesting that last poll, that the data was perceived as the highest, the biggest issue, because actually, in my mind, I mean, okay, the navigation of all the available data out there is a challenge, but there's a boatload of data out there. I think that it's perhaps the way we use it and digest it is the bit that has to be worked on. But I personally, I touched on it before. I think that to say this is a data problem and only think of it from that point of view would be a bit of a misstep. I think that the ability to do the client outreach is probably the gnarliest bit in some ways to do, but it's often, I suppose, a bit of an afterthought. And I think that, yeah, there's some opportunities I mentioned before, that having a good client experience and being able to provide your clients with a good interface will provide you with. But I think Sam picked it up earlier on when she used her example. You know, the single biggest barrier to achieving good quality KYC outreach is a bad process that results in a client not wanting to do it. Clients will put up with a bad process at the beginning of the relationship because ultimately they want something. They want the account open. They want the funding or the FX or whatever it is they're trying to apply for. At the point where it just becomes an admin function, no one's really interested in doing it. And to Sam's point earlier, you'd sooner just switch banks than have to go through the process. I think that actually, if you get the client outreach process right, the data challenges and all that other stuff, some of that can go away, because often the best source of data is the client. And the reason we don't go to them is because we perceive that as being the most painful and the most obtrusive thing to do. But if you solve that problem, if you make that a seamless experience, if you tie it to some other value generating activity for them, then a lot of the other problems can go away. It's not a silver bullet, nothing is. It requires the tech stack we've talked about before, but I think it can go a long way to solving the problems. And I think we often draw a line around the KYC process, and the mindset tends to be, let's do as much as we possibly can without having to bother the client. And that mindset probably comes from the fact that we know that in the past, that engagement has always been negative. It's never been a positive experience. Change that, you can change the way of gathering the data, and the whole thing turns in its head.
Yeah, Cecile, what would you say there from a vendor perspective of other sort of RegTech solutions? And while you answer, I'm going to ask you a question. No names, please, but it asks: do pKYC type tools exist? What are they? Or is it more about process and other existing technology? So do you see particular RegTech solutions, or is it about process and some of the tough tech you have?
Well, to me, most likely a bank will need a combination of tools based around their existing architecture, their data, their resources, their use cases. And the RegTech market continues to boom, with multiple firms offering a variety of broad to niche services. So you go from sourcing data to aggregating data to deduplicating data to workflow onboarding, and we know a few, to service screening. Another service that could be added actually in the loop as part of pKYC is the adverse media type of information that could be then automated and integrated into the loop, which is rarely done as part of a normal KYC onboarding process. Whether there is already a pKYC miracle tool, I don't know about it. If it does exist, I've never come across it, but you know, I'm not. Maybe it does, but I don't know. I don't think so. I think it's more a combination of the different tools, and it's very important upfront to actually understand what you need and which tool works best for your own situation as a bank.
Okay, that's great. We've got quite a few audience questions here, so let's go through a few more. Sam, coming to you. If you were CIO of a bank contemplating pKYC, what technical questions would you be asking your financial crime and surveillance teams?
Ooh, I think the first technical question I would ask them is, why do we need to get something else? So I would want to know that they actually have understood how to leverage the existing tools they have, and what's the gap they think that's missing, based on how they do or how they've set up their workflow. And the reason why I say this is I've seen too many people get amazing solutions and they use about 20% of their functionality because they don't really understand how to use it or set it up, or they didn't spend the time with the vendor that they should have understanding what it does. So if I was CIO, I would go, But we're not going to go lazy and go, we'll just buy us something else and we'll figure out how that works. But really make them tell me, do you understand what the potential is for what we currently have? Tell me why you think we can't do it. It may be something we can solve internally, or map me out your workflow and show me how it is you want it to work. And then I would go away with my team and go, is this really the most efficient way to do it? Is in fact maybe some natural language processing far more effective, looking at some of the other materials we get in with other technology? Or is our problem here we need to use some AI that goes out and looks at the results of our adverse media and actually can pinpoint things we really want to look at to trigger a pKYC review? So that's kind of how I would approach it as a CIO, is first, why do you need it? It's not Christmas. We can't buy everything. And do you really understand what we've got to really narrow down where you think the gap is?
Okay, excellent. And Gareth, one for you. It says, how can managed services support pKYC and what are their limitations?
I think there's definitely a role for managed services. I think that I mentioned the screening hits, for example, earlier on, and disposing of the false positives. I think that's often an area that people think about when you look at automating or doing a review on a more regular basis, and event-driven reviews in particular. I think that for me, again, Cecile touched on it before around the resourcing. I think you have to recognise that as an organization, if you're moving to this model, you're going to move away from something that's relatively linear and predictable to something that's not. I think that means that you need to, your end state resourcing needs to look different than it does today, but it also means there's probably going to be a few peaks and troughs along the way. You're going to have to adjust along the way. And I think the use of managed service providers and scale partners and essentially having a capacity to be able to quickly upscale or downscale a team in response to some of that demand is going to be really important, particularly when we're in this maybe hybrid state of sort of review and pKYC, because I don't think we're ever going to get to a stage where you can just switch the switch and we will move to that new solution. I think the other thing is as well, the using often, and I suppose this is to an extent the point Sam made, sometimes the vendors who provide the tools and then the service layer around those tools they know it better than anyone else does. They know their technology, and I would say utilize them. And whether that's from a training perspective, whether that's from a managed service perspective, make sure you're getting the most out of the tools you've got and you understand what they do and the capabilities of them. And I think, as Sam said, often that the vendors are the best place to start with that, because they built them, they developed them, and they know how to operate them fundamentally.
Okay.
If I can
Cecile,
add something, I mean, to your question earlier when you said there is pKYC tools, obviously not yet, but there are some tools that are enabling that function more than the others. So that's what you want to look at, because rather than recreating everything, there are some tools, and I won't mention names because you said no names, but there are some tools that are enabling as part of their workflow a perpetual or smart KYC.
Okay, thanks for that. And one more, and I'm going to put this one to you, Chor, and it says, does the panel think pKYC will be a competitive advantage? And if so, would it make sense to be an early mover?
Certainly is. I can say it from my current experience. To be the early mover on it, it will actually answer the next point I'm going to make is, it creates client experience. I touch on it a lot of times with my peers, with people that bounce ideas off. It allows you to have to talk to the client.
Oh, Chor is having trouble with his internet again. So let's move on from that where, but I think we would all agree, would we not, that it is probably a competitive advantage if you can get it right? Yeah. Okay, sorry about that, Chor, but let's move on, and let me come to you, Cecile, if I may. Operational and business opportunities of a successful implementation, what's there?
Yeah, so we've mentioned a few already, but to try to summarize, so we can imagine reducing the cost, the operational cost, by the automation and having resources focusing on more added value tasks, or where the risk of the or predicted risk of the client is higher, and so on. So operational cost is something that could be a target. You would like as well still to increase your regulatory and compliance and minimize the risk exposure. That's something for sure. I also wanted to mention that, again, back to the idea of taking the opportunity of pKYC to create something else. we could create the idea of the P revenue generation, because there are some banks, a lot, where there is such a backlog of clients late on their KYC. They are actually, the activity of the client is suspended because the KYC is out of date or late for whatever reason, and then you actually can't, as suspended means, you can't deal with the client, you can't propose your product, your activity to that client. So through pKYC, we could actually imagine a P revenue generation, because the flow will make it dynamic and fluid, so you shouldn't have the backlog.
Okay, that's great. We are coming close to the end of our time. So for our final item today, let me ask all our speakers what advice they would give to practitioners working on pKYC. Chor, do you want to start there? And if we can hear you, all the better. Oh, you've gone very quiet again. Okay, let's leave it for now. Gareth, a bit of advice for our practitioners, please.
Sure. I mean, I think that for me, we've covered these points before, but I guess in a sort of by way of summary, you've got to get the buy-in across the stakeholders. I think that, and I don't just mean the sort of traditional ones of KYC and compliance and technology, but you need to get the business buy-in, because I think that there are definitely some positive revenue generating opportunities here. And if you can get the business to buy into those, then they'll probably help fund the initiative, but I think also they'll get behind it and enable us to enable firms to really take advantage of what the undoubted benefits from a cost saving and an ROI perspective are. I think also I've touched on client outreach processes enough, but I won't do so again. And I think the mindset piece, I come back to that again as well. It's about that buying across the organization. It's about having all the same stakeholders, but identifying all of the opportunity and also being upfront about the level of impact there's going to be, the fact we might need to upscale on the managed services or some extra heads for a period of time. There might be some extra requirements to spend some money on tech, notwithstanding the fact we should make sure we understand the tech we've already got and that we're using it to the best of our ability and the best of our knowledge and getting the most out of that first of all. But I think if you trade those things off, make the business case correctly, it should make itself. I think that there's significant benefit there.
Okay, Cecile, what advice do you have for our audience?
Yeah, I'd be quick. We need to, it's an opportunity, to reassess the bank risk appetite. It requires a strong, structured change management program. I would advise to go for single, central, end-to-end solution for a bank. And the usual advice, try on a sample set, fail to learn, refine to grow. Because it's not an obvious one. So yeah.
Okay, Sam.
I would say, without completely shooting myself in the foot, compliance people do not make good systems designers. So your job is to come up with output you need, not and how do you want the system to be designed to do X, Y, and Z. So I would say, start out thinking about what is the risk you want to mitigate. What's the purpose of the pKYC? What will be the benefits that you will gain by using pKYC over your existing processes? And how ideally would that output look? Would it read straight into your monitoring? Would it read straight into your risk rating program? What would be the thing you need to leverage to make you most efficient? And then sit down with your systems people or your risk team or whoever you have who's really valuable and start talking to them about, so what would we need out of technology to make that happen? You will find you will have a much more useful discussion with the solution providers you explore. And it really helps them if they know what the desired output it is that you need, rather than you showing up going, tell me all the great possibilities that I could develop, only 12 months time, find you're no further ahead than you were at the beginning. So really reach out, really inform questions. Don't think you're the best designer of it. Be really clear what your compliance requirements are.
Okay, and I have a few words here from Chor, who's having a bit of trouble with the internet. He's far away, but he says, get an agreed goal among the key stakeholders right from the beginning. Be clear up front that this may go through several phases. Therefore, I need to scroll down a bit. Therefore, it may not be a one-off project. Okay, wise advice. Thank you all very, very much indeed. And thank you for sharing your experience and your expertise today. Thank you too to Luxoft and Refinitiv for sponsoring today's webinar. It's been a very interesting conversation. Before we close, just a few 18 group items that may be of interest to you. If you scroll down your screen to additional options, you can find out more about how you could use our platform, 18 Connect, to deliver interactive events and webinars. And you can download the latest versions of our ESG handbook and regulatory data handbook. That said, that's it for today. So thank you again to Cecile, Sam, Gareth and Chor. And thank you to all of you who've taken part in the webinar. Please complete our feedback form, as we're always keen to hear your views and improve our products. Meantime, thanks again and goodbye.